Hey everyone, for those of you who haven't been here before, my name is Derek Royden. I write for a website called nationofchange.org, and I try to do a vlog like this one every week or so. Before we get to today's story, I want to kind of talk about something kind of positive that I found. There's a new search engine now. It's not perfect. The results are basically based on the Bing search engine, but it's called Ecosia. And basically, what happens is each time you search, it gets you closer to them actually using the profits from their advertising to plant a tree. So I think the number is 42 searches, and then a tree is planted in your name, and they're doing this throughout the world. It actually looks pretty legit from the website. So I changed the search engine on my main computer, which I use for my writing, and I think I'm already at like 30 some odd searches. So it's just kind of a way that you can, and they will, nothing like this is still a kind of a capitalist thing. So they still have to pay their employees. They still have to, work on their technology. But it's a really good thing to use those search results to plant trees. So I hope that some of you will maybe switch to Ecosia as your search engine. I'm not paid by them in any way. I just thought that this was a really good idea. And the search results using basically it's the Bing engine are just as good or pretty close to what you would get on Google. So I don't think it would actually cause too many problems for your searches. So, having said that, to get right to today's story, it's kind of an interesting one. A few weeks ago, I think, or maybe 6 to 8 weeks ago, I did another story on Yemen. And I was trying to find a way to kind of humanize Yemenis for my audience. I don't know if I succeeded, but I discovered that Yemen is basically the birthplace of modern coffee, the coffee we all drink, whether you drink the filter coffee, which I just think is pretty much black water, or you drink delicious espresso-based beverages. It comes from Yemen originally. This is a plant that's actually African, but one of the reasons why the main type of coffee that's people drink around the world is Arabica is because the first people to actually produce this coffee in the way we currently drink it were the people of Yemen. So I had hoped, and also one of the ports is actually called Mocha after the beans that came from there, which were chocolatey, and of course now we drink kind of like a hot chocolate espresso mix and call it a mocha. So this is actually from Yemen. So it's kind of interesting, and it kind of, I hope, it kind of humanized the Yemeni people because they're just human beings like you or I. So today's story, to continue, was actually featured on NPR, which is National Public Radio in the United States, and it's about coffee, a subject that's endlessly fascinating for me. So the article is entitled "Coffee Rust Threatens Latin American Crop. 150 years ago, it wiped out an empire." So the author, Jeff Kohler, starts. 5 years ago, Finca El Valle, a small family-run coffee farm south of Antigua, Guatemala, was producing 140,000 pounds of superior quality Arabica for a select handful of America's premier specialty coffee roasters. An outbreak of coffee leaf rust, which I'd never heard of before reading this article, caused by the fungus Hemileia vastrix, I hope I got that right, probably didn't, hit the celebrated coffee-producing region in 2012, and by 2014, it had infected the entire farm. That year, El Valle harvested a meager 28,000 pounds of coffee, an 80% drop. The next harvests were even smaller, with the lowest coffee prices in a dozen years. Reviving the farm has been deeply challenging. "We are in the middle of the biggest coffee crisis of our time," said the Guatemalan producer and exporter Joseu Morales, who works with over 1,300 growers. Central America, where smallholders produce 80% of the region's coffee, has been particularly hard hit by rust. Some 70% of the farms have been affected, and over 1.7 million coffee workers have lost their jobs. Many are leaving the coffee lands to find work elsewhere. And of course, in these countries in Central America, I mean, there's already a crisis in terms of, at least in urban areas, of violence. I mean, there's currently a caravan of about 5,000 people approaching the United States border, causing the current president of the U.S. to continue acting like a complete and utter jackass about people fleeing violence. But on top of that, there is this problem with coffee, and this is a real economic trial for the people of Central America. The problem is not just the rust and catastrophically low coffee prices. Stuart McCook explained to NPR. He's the author of The Upcoming Coffee is Not Forever, A Global History of the Coffee Rust. It's difficult for farmers to weather both. For observers of coffee history, such as McCook, there are strong parallels to another outbreak, and this is kind of where it gets interesting. In 1869, Sri Lanka, then known as Ceylon, was one of the world's largest coffee producers, exporting over 100 million pounds annually. A new railway connected the coffee-producing center with the coast. A steady flow of cheap labor was coming from South India, and market prices were high. With a growing global demand for coffee, the future of the island's principal industry seemed assured. But then, in the south center of the island, small, pale, yellow spots began appearing on the upper surfaces of coffee leaves. These increased in size and coalesced with adjacent spots. On the underside of the leaves, circular, yellow-orange, dust-like spores formed. New spores developed from these lesions and passed to other plants. The fungus did not kill the plants outright, but rather debilitated them. The leaves eventually fell, and nutrients to the beans got choked off, causing yields to plunge. It was the first global outbreak of the fungus that had first been reported less than a decade before by a British explorer around Lake Victoria in what is today Kenya. Very little was known about the disease. Farmers planted coffee elsewhere in Ceylon, but with wet and windy conditions ideal for the fungus to reproduce, their crops didn't remain rust-free for long. The spores detached into the air and floated along with the winds or rains, on field workers or birds or even insects. Able to survive for months, the spores could, once in contact with coffee leaves, under the right conditions, germinate and penetrate the leaf within a few hours. The island's coffee estates were soon engulfed. So then they go on to talk about by 1879, production had begun a rapid and steady decline. That year, London's Royal Botanic Gardens sent an inexperienced 25-year-old recent Cambridge grad named Harry Marshall Ward to the island. During his 2-year stay, the mycologist proved that the parasitic fungus H. vastatrix caused leaf rust, and he methodically worked out the pathogen's life cycle. Yet he could offer planters no means to stop the thorough destruction of their livelihood. If the rise of the island's coffee industry was swift, it had come about in just 50 years, the crash came even faster. Basically, within a 16-year period, coffee exports went down 80%. And by 1890, just 2 decades after the arrival of the rust, 90% of the area under coffee cultivation had been abandoned. The crop virtually disappeared from the island. The coffee industry, meanwhile, in Latin America, was burgeoning as it remained isolated from rust. And this is kind of an interesting thing about this, is that this is something that people absolutely simply could not control. When the rust reached the west coast of Africa in the 1950s, one of the all-time catastrophic plant diseases was just a direct shot across the Atlantic on oceanic winds. In 1970, rust was surfaced in Brazil, and panic swept through the industry. Coffee beans were central to the region's economy and a key export. The Colombian Federation of Coffee Growers predicted losses of up to 80% for its farmers. In a dozen years, rust had spread to every major coffee-producing country in the Americas. For a few decades, the region managed to avoid a Ceylon-like meltdown through an array of modern tools. These included replanting infected farms with newly developed hybrid varieties that, while inferior tasting to traditional Arabica, had a strong genetic resistance to rust. Now, it's interesting, in the article here I noticed they don't mention robustica beans, which are actually the second most popular beans in the world. The majority of the beans produced in Brazil now are of this robustica variety. It's more bitter, than Arabica, but it's used, usually it's blended in with Arabica beans in the espresso you drink at home. And it is apparently immune to this rust. So, I mean, we might have to, the article makes it seem like this is the end of the world, but it might just be that we might have to develop a different taste for maybe a kind of more bitter coffee. Just use honey or sugar. Especially in the last decade, however, waves of outbreaks have devastated Latin America, which produces about 7/8 of the world's Arabica coffee beans. Since 2012, some farms have seen a 50 to 80% loss of production, though several countries have been able to return to near pre-rust numbers through systematic replanting of resistant varieties. Coffee rust has no cure. The impact can be reduced to an extent, but not eradicated. Scientists are warning that resistant varieties are not a long-term solution. The fungus is evolving and will likely overcome resistant genes eventually, in 5 years, in 1 year, in 10 years, says Benoit Bertrand, one of the world's foremost coffee geneticists at CIRAD, the French agricultural research organization. We know it's a question of time. With the global demand for coffee, especially gourmet coffee, continuing to grow, Latin America is unlikely to switch crops. That's what Ceylon did, very successfully. Today, Sri Lanka is the world's fourth largest producer of tea. So I just wanted to get this story out there. I thought it was pretty interesting. It seems like they're, once again, a little bit dire in their predictions when there are other varieties of resistant coffee that can be planted. They might not be as tasty as Arabica, but it seems a little bit overblown. But nonetheless, what happened in Ceylon or Sri Lanka is very real. An industry that was creating a great deal of wealth was suddenly, almost overnight, eliminated. So it is something to think about. It's just a natural process. This doesn't have anything to do with some of the other things we talk about in terms of climate or biodiversity loss. It's just a disease. And it was bound to get to Central America eventually. It's just, the timing is really terrible because right now, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador especially have immense problems as it is. So that's it for today's story. I hope you found it interesting. I hope you'll check out acacia.org, which is the search engine I talked about at the beginning of the video. And I hope you have a great day. And always remember,